The next few sessions are really going to be looking back to some of what was discussed at the last World Dyslexia Forum 4 years ago in Paris, and talking about what's stayed the same, what's changed. And so we're going to be talking from the perspectives of different languages, but I do think that actually across the languages there's much commonality and much transfer that, to be had. So back in 2010, my brief was to summarize best practice in dyslexia assessment and intervention across all English-speaking countries. So just a 2-minute job there. And so what I'm going to do is just actually show some of my slides from 4 years ago, just so that we can kind of do a compare and contrast in terms of what is still relevant, but then also talking about what has changed. And there have been some fairly significant changes even in the last 4 years, which is exciting for the field of dyslexia as a whole. So back in 2010, we really talked about the fact that dyslexia is a continuum. It's not a discrete thing. And so the task of assessment is really quite difficult because, in a sense, government systems, educational systems are having to choose their own cut-off point for what kind of reading difficulty is serious enough to call dyslexia and get special help. So this is a challenge across countries to decide where the cut-off point is, because in terms of the behaviour and the neurology that we see in children, there isn't a clear cut-off. We have to make that decision ourselves. We also talked then about the key ingredients of assessment, and I'm sure it's no surprise to you, phonology featured quite highly in that list of things to assess. So we talked about the need to assess phonological awareness, phonological memory, and also rapid naming, as you've heard this time as well. Obviously, you also want to look directly at a child's reading and spelling skills in terms of single real words. You want to look at pseudo words, as Linda has mentioned, and also connected text. And then we also mentioned that it was important to look at wider cognitive skills. And I think in terms of a slight shift that's happened, I think you've heard in this conference that there's a real sense that although phonology is clearly critical, we do need to be looking at other things too. And I think we've heard a good argument across these couple of days in terms of the importance of things like visual attention and visual factors. The types of assessment for this kind of thing are still developing. It's many of the things that you've heard about are experimental measures, and so I think a challenge for us for the next 4 years or however many years is really thinking about how we can develop easily accessible measures for practitioners to use of these additional factors we're talking about: auditory processing, visual attention, and also, as we've heard, the genetic history is quite strong for dyslexia, so it's important to get a sense of whether any known attention, language or reading issues are in the family history. We also talked about best practice for intervention, and again, no surprise here in terms of what was said to be critical. We talked about the fact that it's vital to have explicit training in phonological awareness, a strong focus on phonological decoding, and this being very systematic, intensive where possible, and brought in as early as it can be. We also talked about having independent reading of progressively more difficult texts, and also it was mentioned that having comprehension strategies was important. I think that's the salience of comprehension has become more important or more visible in the last 4 years, and I'm going to mention that in a minute. So in terms of process as well as just the content of instruction, we talked about things that have now, I think, become quite familiar, and they're things that you see in the online courses that we've been talking about. So a strong focus on multisensory techniques, cumulative and sequential, small steps, so that these children that have often experienced a lot of failure can experience success, and so they can start a positive cycle versus the cycle of feeling that they just can't do reading. Ensuring that there's lots of opportunity for automaticity. Again, we've heard from many of the speakers how this is a critical aspect that has been, I think, overlooked to some degree in the initial excitement over phonics. Providing mental modelling, so this is especially important for comprehension, providing children with visible, verbalising what you do as you decode and as you comprehend, so that they can follow the model of a skilled reader. And finally, linked to the small steps, really providing opportunities for success. Often we're working with children, as you're all aware, I don't need to tell you this, who have experienced frustration with reading, so we really need to try and break that cycle and make it something, find a level at which they can find success. And finally, in terms of the school workforce, I discussed a model that was proposed by Jim Rose in the UK that was suggesting that we need a core level of skills in detecting reading issues across all teachers. Then we're going to have a group of teachers with some more advanced skills, ideally at least one of these teachers per school. And then finally, perhaps across schools or school districts, you're going to have highly specialised teachers. So we're not expecting all teachers to know everything, but there is a continuum of knowledge. And I think, as we've heard at this forum, getting that core skill level across all teachers is a real challenge. And that's true across many, many countries, but I think it's clearly a salient factor in Brazil. So, 4 years later, what's changed? Has anything changed? And I think while we wouldn't overturn any of the things I've just mentioned, I don't think any of these things have been discredited or debunked. So much of this stands, and you've heard this message here today and yesterday very clearly. But I think there are some additional factors that we really need to take on board moving forward, and I'm now going to talk about these briefly. So first of all, I think we're seeing in schools and in countries or districts where a basic level of phonic instruction is now in place. It's almost as if we're seeing a new level of problems. Now we've kind of crossed that hurdle of getting children decoding. We're now seeing that there's a new level of problems that we don't have all the answers for. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And also, it's impossible to ignore the absolutely exponential development of digital technology. And this has two influences on our children with dyslexia, well, at least two. One is that it's changing the cognitive demands of reading, and I think we all have a sense of this. I'm sure when you read, maybe if you're reading on a small mobile phone versus when you're reading on a tablet, when you're maybe trying to read lots of information on a desktop computer, and you're finding it quite a struggle or a strain compared to when you're potentially reading books. I think we've all experienced instances where we can see that actually reading digitally is different, and sometimes some things feel easier about it and some things feel harder. And so I actually believe that the cognitive demands of digital reading are slightly different to reading books. And so the most kind of radical manifestation of this, thinking about this, we could actually say that maybe in 10 years, 20 years, the group who are going to be disabled might be just a slightly different group of children to those currently disabled, because disability is a match between what we bring to the table in education, the skills we bring to reading, and then the demands that reading expects of us. And I think those demands are slightly changing. And I don't think this is either good or bad. I think it's going to be different for different children. So going beyond phonics, so as I've said, in some situations now we do have children who are able to receive a solid grounding in phonics, and things like the online courses are helping with this, as well as online delivery of literacy instruction. I'm going to give some examples in a minute. But then, so our problem space, as we could call it, has shifted a bit. So one question that Ken Pugh mentioned earlier this morning is, we've now found, we're almost identifying this new group of children who aren't responding to this practice that is our best practice. You know, we're giving them our best, and yet they're still not responding to even quite intense intervention. So, and we haven't cracked what to quite do about these children. And I think this is where, as Ken was mentioning, neuroscience might be really helpful, because there are behavioural studies that have tried to identify the profile of these treatment resistors or non-responders. And behaviourally, we haven't got a clear picture yet. So I'm actually very excited in terms of what neuroscience may do to help with this question. And then also, I think something that's really coming into perspective is decoding is only part of the story. And I think we're seeing that we're getting children where we've helped them decode, and that's amazing. But we're finding they still can't. They're kind of getting to a level where they're still not really comprehending, they're not fluent. And this makes sense if we think about the simple view of reading, which has been referred to in this forum and is a common way of looking at reading, especially in the US. So in its most basic elements, this is a simplification. We can think of the tasks of learning to read as learning to decode, but then we also need the language comprehension. And in dyslexia, in many cases, decoding is a bottleneck, so comprehension can be impeded. Some children may actually have a decoding issue as well as a language comprehension issue. And so we really need to learn how to address these comprehension problems. And I think in theory we know what to do. We know that we want to really reinforce vocabulary instruction for children, not just content words for school, so learning scientific terms, but children also need to learn the terms that help them navigate school, things like the word discuss or debate, these slightly more nebulous terms. We also need to give children strategies on being aware of when they're not comprehending and helping them learn what helps them. So either chunking text into smaller chunks so it can work with their memory better, or asking themselves periodically what they can remember. Various strategies we know. But even with this knowledge, a sobering picture it was recently highlighted by Sharon Vaughan, who's a very prolific reading researcher in the US. And in a recent research paper, she demonstrated that while in the early elementary grades, and sorry that the graph here is quite small to read, I'll give you the highlights. In the early elementary stages, in terms of the aspects of reading that have been intervened on, we can see fairly decent effect sizes. And the effect sizes they're based on standard deviations, and they're a measure of the effectiveness of an intervention. So we're seeing fairly healthy pictures in the elementary stages, but when we're looking at older children who have received some years of intervention, so here we have comprehension interventions, so 37 studies. So people have been putting a lot of energy into improving reading comprehension, and yet it's actually a very small effect size that we're seeing, 0.09. So we know what we think are the things to do, but clearly comprehension is so complex that it's harder to move than decoding. It's harder to see progress, and so this is a challenge for our education systems across the world. Once children have got behind, how can we get them back up to the region of their peers? I'm not going to say back up to the level of their peers, because this may not be the first realistic goal here. Just to give an example of some initiatives going on worldwide. So the US government has been really realizing this is an issue and has recently put a lot of money into some grant initiatives. One that Hugh Katz mentioned yesterday that he was involved with is the Reading for Understanding grants. I've also been involved with this with the Boston site and Catherine Snow, where we've been trying to build adolescent vocabulary. And we're getting some results, but it's definitely hard work to work at this middle school level and see convincing results. So now, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to move into talking about what's happening with technology. And clearly this is an overview because vast things are happening here that are very exciting. As I mentioned, I think technology is changing what reading is in some degrees. The other thing that technology offers is new delivery systems. So just to talk about both of these, so in terms of the changing demands of reading, we have unprecedented opportunities to tailor text to individuals. We can change the font size, the colours, but at the moment we don't know the best parameters for individual children. So this is a real research priority. And just to give some examples of work that's going on, with a collaborator at Harvard, Matthew Schneps, we did a study with some high school students with dyslexia, and we found for a subgroup of those, the most poorly performing, this group of readers actually comprehended better and read more fluently on a smartphone, even compared to an iPad or paper. So we tried to match the kind of coolness factor by comparing smartphones and iPads, thinking they were both similarly motivating. But we saw better comprehension for some, and we think that this is due to the smaller text window and links to some of the research we've heard about in the previous talks about the role of visual attention alongside phonology. So this is something to try with students, a very easy an easy kind of accommodation. We're currently using eye tracking and EEG to try and work out the reasons for this specifically and also work out exactly who could benefit. But this is just one example of the way forward. In terms of new intervention delivery systems, we're now seeing that programs can have a far greater geographical reach electronically. So one example is the Grapho game from Finland, the Jyväskylä team that we've heard so much about. They have the Grapho game program which has been translated into many languages and is proving successful. There's also an English-based program from Canada called Abracadabra, which you can have a look at as well as an example. So these interventions are really meaning that intervention can be less tied to school buildings, and I think this is good for us and dyslexia. It means that we can have very tailored interventions. We can use the adaptive computer programs to really make things to the right difficulty level. But, as the Jyväskylä team are also pointing out, we should be excited, but kind of moderately, well, we should tame our excitement slightly. Heikki Luutinen and colleagues did a study that was published this year in a journal called Computers and Education, and they were looking at what's the optimal kind of reward structure on a computer game. You know, often you get kind of little electronic rewards on games, and they were looking at what the optimal challenge level was. And slightly scarily, they found that actually, when children were left to their own devices on these computer games, although rewards, like little electronic rewards, were initially appealing and helpful, after a little go on the games, it lost all its usefulness and motivation. And challenge level actually didn't have a significant, there wasn't a discernible pattern. So we need to get cleverer in terms of how we can motivate children to do this independently. And that's, I think, for the next World Dyslexia Forum, these are the types of things we need to be looking at. So, to summarise, I think in the last 4 years, in English-speaking countries, but also beyond, I think we're seeing new challenges, which I think is actually a sign of our progress. I think we've kind of reached a new level, and our new vista has new challenges we can see. So I think the need for teacher knowledge regarding the basics is something that we're clearly working on. Adolescent literacy problems, we need to work on those. And we need to try and keep up with technology and all its affordances. So thank you very much.
Thank you.